today's topic is ceaseless change. And I was invited by Renee to kind of just give perspective. My background is actually Western trained medicine. I have a MD, and so my formal training is actually in Western sciences. However, and I don't want to get into a long story, but when I was in medical school, one of my classmates had a black belt in Aikido. And so he took us, about 10 of our classmates, to his dojo, and we practiced. At the end of every session, we would do breathing meditation. And we would focus on our second chakra, the Dantian. He called it the one spot. And it was kind of interesting because when I went off to Pennsylvania in my surgical training, I was the only one under the microscope that didn't have a tremor. And my colleagues would be astounded. They said, you know, everybody shakes. In fact, the microscope magnifies your native tremor. How come you don't have one? Well, I said, well, I just focus on my one spot and the tremor goes away. So I was then promoted to the director of microsurgical replantation services at Penn State. When I got back to Honolulu, I decided to pick up martial arts again. And rather than, you know, having my wrist twisted and being thrown around, I said, what can I do that I can do into, a long time, into an older age? And of course, Tai Chi came up. And when I started practicing Tai Chi, I realized, gee, I must have been a Taoist in a previous life, because everything resonated with me in terms of the Tai Chi philosophy and that practice. And so that's how I actually got into Tai Chi as a martial art as well as a philosophy. I studied many religions when I was in high school, and understood that the differences between beliefs are actually interpretations. They're human interpretations of a spiritual subject. But the common threads between religions and between beliefs, those are actually the spiritual truths. So those are things that actually bring us together, despite having different beliefs. And it is also that energy connection that I was talking about earlier, that we all share in this this realm, this dimension, that connectedness that holds this universe together. And in the Taoist philosophy, and this goes way back. Actually, if you go back into Ayurvedic philosophy, concept San Chit Ananda comes up. So they talk about basically the mind of God. Essentially, the San is this consciousness, this awareness that is Chit, which is actually an awareness of itself. It is all powerful, permeates everything, and it exists in a state of ananda or bliss. And that basically is sort of the state of the universe before the Big Bang, before it was created. And Taoist philosophy believes that at the beginning, this consciousness made a decision to create the polar opposites, the yin, the yang, and all the 10,000 things that arose from the Big Bang. Because at that point, the state of Wu Qi, as we call it, is the state of unchanging existence, in bliss, was very static. But at the point of the Big Bang, everything became more interesting. And that then led to the interrelationships of hot and cold, male and female, yin and yang, and so forth. So this quote that Renee suggested from Lao Tzu: if you realize that all things change, there is nothing you will try to hold on to. If you are not afraid of dying, then there is nothing you cannot achieve. And this is so true, because human nature has this basic need to understand. And if things constantly change, how can you get a grasp or get a hold or an understanding of things that are constantly changing? But the other part of this quote from Lao Tzu: there was something undefined and complete coming into existence before heaven and earth. How still it was and formless, standing alone and undergoing no change, reaching everywhere and in no danger of being exhausted. It may be regarded as the mother of all things. I do not know its name, and I give it the designation of the Tao, the way or course. Making a further effort to give it a name, I call it the Great. So as I understood, Tai Chi Chuan is commonly called the Grand Ultimate. And so it is, I think, a perspective of understanding everything that is. And if you go just one moment before the Big Bang, that's what these this quote presents, is everything and nothing all together in the state of existence. And at the point of the origin of our universe, the Big Bang, this was then created, and the relationships of these opposite characteristics started interplaying with each other. And from there, it became very interesting. And it continues to remain interesting because of the way these changes occur. So in the topic that we are presented today, ceaseless change, it is true. The universe will continue to change, and it is, how should I say, it's not possible to expect it to go back to no change. So, Benjamin Franklin was credited with that quote, the only thing that we can count on are death and taxes. Well, I would say the only thing we can count on is change. And so understanding and accepting that, it makes our life infinitely more interesting. The challenges that occur from change, we accept, and we deal with it in a different perspective. In other words, rather than avoiding it or abhorring change, we accept it with grace. And that actually is the key to actually making life easier. And even transition into death can be made easier. So that's my spiel on sort of how the Taoists look at things. Okay, they start with perfection in the beginning, and then as things are expanding and interacting with their opposites, the universe as a whole remains a system of perfection. It's just when you get into those interactions, you then develop a bias on one side or the other. That perception then creates stress as you say, oh, you know, we're unbalanced and we need to bring things back to balance, and you know, there's too much heat or too much cold, and then you start working on trying to control these elements. But the Taoist perspective is the balance is there, everything is perfect, and it's a matter of accepting what is changing, and then, you know, harmony will be achieved.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk and appreciated it. And what it brings to mind for me is the Four Noble Truths, that life is suffering. And in my terminology, the reason we suffer is because we want it to be different. And there's a way out, and the way out is the Eightfold Path. And I've really looked at that in terms of change, that what causes the suffering is we think it shouldn't be that way. And I love what you said about accepting the balances. Everything's perfect just as it is, even when it's not in balance, even when it feels like the world is, and it does, especially nowadays, that there's so much pain and suffering. And it's like really understanding that this is what's true and this is the way it is, and wanting it to be different. Now, it doesn't mean we can't work toward it to be different, or work in ourselves to feel love and forgiveness and faith and trust. But that if we deny and keep saying, well, it shouldn't be that way, then it becomes a lot more painful, because that causes the suffering. So I really appreciate this subject. I think it's really important, especially nowadays with all that's happening. And I really appreciated your talk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your comment, Diane. You know, that Tai Chi symbol where you have yin and yang coming together, it at the maximum of yang, there's always that dot, that actually yeah, exactly, that actually represents the persistence of yin in the maximum yang phase, and vice versa. In the maximum yin phase, there is a small bit of yang, and this is not a static symbol. If you think of it spinning, it continuously works in balance, and it's not just the two dimensions. Actually, it comes in and out of the frame in a three-dimensional sphere. So when you think of all of that, it's like electrons in the cloud of an atom. It just continuously moves, but in itself, the system is perfect. And so where we are now, as Diana kind of alluded, things sometimes seem to be way out of balance, but just know that there is that balancing opposite that is going to pull things back. So as in all cycles, what goes up must come down, and vice versa. Where things appear to be or feel like they're really unbalanced, there is a balancing force that is likely to bring it back. Similar to the phases of the moon, you know, it's basically from a new moon, it's waxing on till it gets to the full moon, and then it wanes and then goes back to the new moon. So that cycle continues on and on and on. And wherever you stand, if you have a bias that you perceive that there's too much yin or too much yang, the Taoists know that it's going to reverse at some point. The balancing is, in a sense, a universal law that nothing will remain static or stagnant. It will constantly shift and change. So, you know, in depression counseling, they say, you know, if you feel like you've hit the bottom of the barrel, there's no way that, you know, things could get any worse. Well, the flip side of that is, well, things can only get better. And so, you know, the key is to find the silver lining in every cloud. Understand that the stresses that come upon us are temporary. They will not remain a permanent stressor in our lives. And we just have to be patient and wait for it to turn around.
What I wanted to mention about this design is we have what looks like a very, very, very regular pattern. It's swirling in toward the center or out from the center. And each of those little sunflower seeds, which is what we're actually seeing in the center, is the kind of the bottom of a sunflower seed. If you think of a sunflower seed as having kind of a pointed top and a heavier bottom. Once you get to the middle of the sunflower, all of a sudden, in order to kind of set this whorl in motion, you're seeing these oddly shaped wedge seeds. And so they don't have the same look as the seeds further on the outside. They look wonked. And when I look at just one of those, I go, something's wrong. Why is that so misshapen? And then I think it speaks to what you're talking about of everything is perfect. It may not be my perception of perfect as, you know, completely symmetrical. It may look wonky, and yet it's exactly what that sunflower needs at that point in its geometry to get the motion going. And so I just think that that's a very helpful metaphor for me to look at what actually is perfection and what is imperfection. And that which seems distorted even may actually be that which is setting things into motion rather than being very regular shaped and actually being something that is just preserving the status quo. So I just wanted to add that to our look at the other circular shape of the yin yang symbol. And also imagining that with that yin yang symbol, no matter which way, you know, we turn it around, we're still seeing something that's in beautiful, perfect balance. However, I had never, before you mentioned it, Randy, thought of that yin yang symbol being in three-dimensional motion in space, and then calling up, for example, the image of an atom. That is always perfect and always different from any microsecond before or after it. Yeah. Robert, did you have a thought you wanted to share?
Well, you know, this idea of perfection, there's constant change. So there's constantly moving towards something. It isn't a stasis like, what was it, Wu Qi before yin yang. Yeah, the universe is perfect. You cannot improve it. That, to me, talks about the dynamics of the universe, its dependability of structure, but it does not refer to the particulars of manifestation. Like there, to me, and I'll be interested in what Dr. Ming has to say, but that they're imperfect actions. You know, there are things that throw the balance out of balance, and of course it will follow a harmonious course, but it may take a a lot of turbulence to get there, you know, what we would call imperfection, so to speak. So that, I have other things, but that's one, I'm interested in what people have to say about that.
Great comment. And of course, we'd love to hear from Dr. Wong, Randy, and the rest of you as well. It is a circle that we're that we're all conversing within. Thank you, Robert.
Well, I would suggest if you look at a source of a river coming downstream, its mission is actually to reach the ocean. But at times along the edges or the banks of the river, if you happen to be a leaf floating down, it sometimes will hit an eddy, which actually will start swirling around. Okay, and the mission of the water molecule is to continue to make its way down to the ocean, but it starts swirling around. So sometimes it gets caught in these eddy currents and they think, gee, I'm going the wrong way. But that happens to be a snapshot in the direction of its flow momentarily. And eventually it does continue on to its course. So that, and I think if you step back far enough, you will see that all of these imperfections are just part of the nature of how this energy flows. So I kind of look at it in a maybe an energetic perspective. That particular water molecule may find itself caught in the eddy, and then it basically finds itself evaporating into the sky, finding its way to a cloud, and then coming back down. And at a different spot, it joins other molecules to form another river someplace else. So it gets very complicated, as the world is complicated, and the balance of things in this world is very, very complex, and it's almost too deep to really get your mind or your thoughts wrapped around it. And if you consider that we're talking the physical 3 dimensions, you add the 4th dimension of time, it is said that, you know, they've counted up to 20 or more dimensions that follow, that are involved in all of these happenings. And so, you know, human nature, to try to understand this, we tend to try to simplify things. And so as you notice, some of my explanations are oversimplifications of concepts that we've discussed. But this is how we understand things. Once we have an understanding, we can move forth with more depth of these questions. And actually, I often say, understanding really starts with a question. If you have a curiosity, that's where wisdom, the seed of wisdom begins.
And that's the second question, is like, where's the self come into play? You know, there's constant change, but if there's constant change, how can there be someone that perceives if it's constantly changing? Doesn't there have to be some kind of stability in perception for there to be the perception of change?
That concept of self that you bring up is actually really very, very deep, because going back to this connection that we all have, we can define self as my identity versus your identity. But again, if we are truly connected, this consciousness that we understand as self, again, going back into that Ayurvedic concept of the San Chit Ananda, San is that consciousness. Chit is the fact that it is aware of itself. and it existed in Ananda, a state of bliss. In one sense, and you know, I'm not talking about religious belief here, but you know, that what they were referring to was the mind of God. And in its wisdom, in the creation of this universe, it bestowed upon each of us in the human race a little bit of itself. And that consciousness, you know, I think it doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to anyone in particular, but it is part of this huge energy field, that consciousness of the all-powerful. Think of the ocean. Think of how vast and huge it is. And it develops energy waves from wind and movement of tides and currents. As one of these waves comes up upon the beach, it basically creates a wave that breaks, and then that spray is that separation of the water molecule into the air, evaporating, going up into the clouds, and eventually coming down as rain to rejoin this vast energy field of the ocean. Same thing with consciousness and your concept of self. I believe the self is the separation of that water molecule from the ocean, which eventually it returns. In one perspective, self can be separated. In another perspective, the self is still connected and not separated because of the energy surrounding it. It's still connected, and even if it's in the sky, in the cloud, it is eventually returned. If you think of it that maybe there was a plan or a purpose for all of this. I've heard that one thought that, you know, basically this mind of God that existed in bliss was getting bored before the Big Bang and decided to kind of make it interesting. And certainly after the Big Bang, everything became interesting. So we are, in one sense, actors on a stage to entertain this consciousness. And we gain, I would say, entertainment just from our dealings with each other. But if you feel that this consciousness permeates each of us and is still part of the collective, it is really our role as actors to make it as interesting as possible. And that's where all the emotional drama comes in, you know, and all of the interactions. And in fact, I was talking to one of my students today that, well, let me digress a little bit. In my practice, I've done quite a few breast reconstructions after cancer. And it always amazes me that when a woman comes in with a diagnosis of cancer and they're talking about taking her breast and I have to reconstruct it, you know, I end up overwhelming them with all the options that they have to decide upon. But, you know, they're now wrestling with, do we go to surgery? Do we go to chemotherapy, radiation? And that's kind of like the Western concept of, we have a perspective of something's wrong, we need to get control and dominate it with these modalities. But if you understand that you have two populations of cells, two communities, your normal cells and the cancer cells. If you talk to the cancer cells and tell them that, you know, if you continue to grow and invade the other cells, the body dies and you die with it. So you know, the solution is really peaceful coexistence. If you can get these two populations to coexist together in harmony, then maybe the host organism can have a long life. And but you know, again, being Western trained, you know, we talk about surgery, we talk about chemotherapy, radiation. You know, these are military assaults on the cancer population. What do? I mean, yes, you know, some of them succumb, but a lot of them will go underground only to pop up at another time. And so it is sort of the same nature that cellular intelligence has, that if they're under attack, they're going to find shelter, they're going to survive, and they're going to fight back. So it kind of makes sense to really have a better understanding between those two cell populations. And we were commenting today that, you know, this is actually the solution for all the international stressors in the world today. If you can get populations and communities that have slightly different beliefs to actually understand, no, we need to coexist in harmony, then, you know, there will be no more war. And everybody has a place, everybody has a role and a purpose. But if we keep going the way we're going, you know, we're going to kill Mother Earth, and there's no room for anybody to survive. Just, you know,
Wong, Dr. Wong, can I move out of the conceptual for a moment and ask you, how does qi work in healing? The actual physical and qi, how does it work in healing?
the Taoist philosophy, actually, which kind of spawned traditional Chinese medicine, looks at things energetically. If you have a circuit and your battery's running down, needs to be recharged. And that's one of the ways that the circuit can continue functioning. So when you can remove the dirty contacts in the circuit, if you can optimize the current through that circuit, then everything, the energy flows the way it's supposed to, and everything works. But if you neglect the circuit, it develops like corrosion on the contacts, and there actually may be some heat destruction in the wiring, breakdown in the insulation, so forth. That represents stagnation of energy flow. And that is where imbalance shows up in the physical body. So the practicing of Tai Chi helps to clear out all the stagnation and the blockages, if you would. So one of the bases for traditional Chinese medicine is to actually clean out the meridians and open up those channels so the energy can flow better. And as you know, in my Tai Chi class, I make suggestions so that you can visualize pulling energy from the center of Mother Earth through your body and delivering it up to sky or heaven. I used to say heaven, but actually I have a belief that heaven is where we are. It is where we live. It is around us. We just forgot. And we need to find it that way. But by moving energy through our bodies from earth to sky and back again, we're cleaning out our meridians. And that's the, again, it's more of the traditional Chinese medicine concept to get rid of all the junk that's preventing health from showing up.
So could we say that we're actually, through change, this constant flow that we are engaging in healing. And wherever we stop changing, stop flowing, get blocked, then that is a sign of actually stagnation, illness, death. And so life is a matter of this change continuing in a healthy way.
Yes. And the logo for the Still and Moving Center, I thought it was so deep. When I first saw it, I thought, this is perfect, because you've got that circle, which represents movement. Okay. And you've got the dot in the center, which represents stillness. There is a relationship between movement and stillness. And it's right there on your logo.
Mary, do you have some thoughts along these lines of this ceaseless change that we always feel ourselves a part of, and the pluses and minuses of it? Or what is your life experience in regard to ceaseless change? I know you've been going through a lot recently.
Thank you. And thank you, Randy, because I was really appreciating what you said about doing things simplistically or explaining things that I can understand, because yeah, I've been going through a lot of changes, and my mind sometimes feels like I don't get it. I've got brain fog, and so thank you. I really appreciate it. And I love the examples that you used about the cancer and our bodies, because it makes perfect sense. Yep, change is inevitable. I remember hearing that analogy, or that thought, from when I was a small kid. So it just continues. And when you talk about accepting change, I guess that's a double-edged sword, because there are some changes that we don't agree with. It might be morally opposite of what we have been taught and what we feel in our hearts. I also know that we are all on this path together. Somebody also mentioned, that we're all different boats, but we're in the same ocean. And I am so grateful for this group, because it certainly helps me to understand a little bit more how diverse we are, and also how much we are alike. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, when you realize that there are some changes or some things that we perceive in the world that absolutely don't agree with our moral values, it is really a question, this idea of acceptance that becomes a passivity. And I almost wonder if that acceptance that becomes a passivity turns into a blockage, versus acceptance in the sense of acknowledgement. I acknowledge what is, and I still see that I have a responsibility to da 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 da. And that might not be to allow that status quo that has developed to remain in my life to the extent that I have something to do with it. I may not be able to change anybody else, but to the extent that I feel myself maybe negatively influenced by what I'm perceiving as something that's wrong in the world, like how do I self-motivate to initiate the change that I feel I need to make, to stay in motion, not to get bogged down, like with worry, with anxiety, with this feeling of this is wrong, but I feel helpless. Okay. So yeah, Diana there. Thank you.
Oh, I just love that. You know, I think there is a difference between accepting reality and doing nothing versus acknowledging what reality is and then listening deeply to what do we do. It may be we pray. It may be we go write letters. It may be we run for office. I don't know what we do, but it's like I think the action is very important but it's only acknowledging what's true. Can we make it? If we keep saying, I don't like it, it's awful, it does stagnate us. We can't do anything, or this isn't happening, or whatever. But if we can acknowledge it in our heart and then feel that, then we can listen deeply and see, what does the universe want me to do? You know, and I think we're all morally and ethically responsible to say there is something. It may be prayer, it may be meditation, it may be doing something, but I think that that's a really important point, because when we move to the Eightfold Path, it is right speech, right meditation, right action, right all of those rights, but it's really about listening and saying, okay, acknowledging it. That's a really important point, because we can see accepting as passivity. You know, it's almost like when someone's been harmed, we talk about forgiveness along the path, not right away, but along the path. And it's not forgiving the action. The action is not okay, but you're forgiving the broken heart that feels that way, or the broken person. And it's only by accepting that there is that happening that we can make a change in ourselves, even if how we see it, or that we choose to react differently and that we choose to respond differently and not just react. So I think that was really important. Thank you, Renee.
Randy.
I agree. I think it's not, recognizing that we are in a perfect universe, that things appear to be not perfect, and just saying, okay, everything's perfect, I'm not going to deal with it, I don't worry about it. That's not what I'm saying. It is, I think, the fact that if you come up with a question like, what's wrong with the world? And just bringing up that question, because of our connectedness in the universe, the answers start coming. We need to be able to listen rather than, getting our own head in the way. And because if we are sincere about that question, what's wrong with the world today? The answers and the directions on how we should act will come through. It is what you think will change the world because of that connection. Dr. Hugh Len, through his Ho'oponopono process, he basically was looking over these records of the Hawaii State Hospital inmates. And as he was reading through what they did, all the horrendous crimes, the pedophilia, rape, and all these horrendous things against their fellow man, his mind would bring up the question. And he recognized, and again, it's an awareness. Remember, consciousness, aware of itself in a state of bliss. His awareness would then bring up his acceptance of his connectedness to these criminals, and said, okay, I will accept responsibility for these crimes because something within me has allowed this to happen. And through that connectedness, he would then forgive himself, the inmate, and there's an expression of love. So there was accepting responsibility and asking for forgiveness, expression of love. And that's how he was able to actually get his whole Ho'oponopono process to work and actually change the atmosphere of Hawaii State Hospital during his tenure. I believe this was in the 80s. And so it is an active process of recognizing something's out of balance, something's not right, and then accepting responsibility to really express compassion for his fellow man. And in this way, he says, you know, each person can change the world, but it has to come from, starts with that question of what's wrong, and then having the conscious thought to make it happen, make it correct.
Hmm. Can you say his name again, please?
Oh, Dr. Hugh, H-E-W, Len, L-E-N. And he was taught by I believe, one of the traditional Hawaiian healers. It's a different concept on the Ho'oponopono that is practiced among families of the Hawaiian culture, but his was, I would say, more on the spiritual realm in how he practiced. You know, when he was assigned as a clinical psychologist to Hawaii State Hospital, I believe in the 70s or 80s. He then, I think, had a 10 or 15-year tenure there. When he started, there were fights breaking out all the time, attempts at escape. The staff would be calling in sick, you know, quite a bit. When he left, they were actually giving passes to the inmates to go visit with their families. The fights actually had just about disappeared, and the staff were happy to come to work, so they weren't calling in sick a lot. So I mean, it was that kind of process, and he didn't really manage behavior as you would expect a psychologist to do. His process was really reviewing these charts, meditating about the crimes, and going through this process of accepting his part in their imbalanced behavior through the connection that he had with everybody else. And we all have this.
A beautiful, beautiful human being to live in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh. Our theme for next week is going to be Kuan Yin, or the Kuan Yin pledge, and he seemed like he was living this very bodhisattvic example of accepting the woes of the world himself for the sake of uplifting the whole. Yeah, so glad to know about him. Thank you. It does give a really different perspective on other human beings when we take into account this idea of ceaseless change. If we really, really, really take it to heart, which it seems as though, for example, this man, Hugh Len, did, then every single human being is capable of some sort of self-regeneration, because change is always possible. Right? And so no one is consigned forever to be stuck in any kind of particular way of being in any kind. I mean, everyone has the possibility of changing and therefore rising out of whatever their particular context or situation is, even if they were to remain behind bars for the entirety of their remaining life. Still, what's going on within can exemplify this ceaseless change that seems to have something to do, it seems to me, with why the universe might have been called into existence. So there is that idea of, and this is crossing from the Taoist Chinese perspective over into the Indian perspective of this idea of lila, L-I-A, which means play. And so there is this ananda, joy, and this playfulness. And so for in a certain way of looking at things, the universe is this grand playfulness that is happening. And then there's this other perspective in which we ask, well, why is it happening? Is there any point to it? And so it seems as though there's another way of looking at why the universe would call itself into being, why God would ask to be able to see himself in more manifested forms. And that might be for the sake of some sort of self-realization, to be able to become more self-aware, casting something outside of itself. The universe then has something looking at itself. And that, as we, to apply that to more of our daily lives, it seems to me that there's always this possibility of like internal evolution, soul evolution, to that we're here for the education of the soul, or whatever aspect of the divine there is that has come into being as us, looking like us. We always have that possibility of constantly uplifting ourselves. So sort of like pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps. And so that seems very meaningful to me, that just as he was doing something to uplift others, this Dr. Hugh Len, we similarly can be doing such things for ourselves, because we know there are all these little aspects of ourselves that are not yet sweetness, goodness, and light. At least I certainly know that about myself. And so what can I do when I find those little lumps of stagnation? How do I run a little bit of energy through those and give those a little bit more lightness and light and understanding, and more of an ability to be sensitive to others who might have that same problem going on? And, maybe to the extent that I'm able to lift myself out of that problem, maybe there's some sort of lifting to those around me, sort of this ripple effect.
In my simplistic answer to how do we do this, simply we need to kind of get the controller mind out of the way so that the manifester, the heart, can function without that restriction. I think a lot of times what we're thinking, and again, this is sort of a controller issue. It overrides everything that's happening. And we forget that sometimes opening this energy center is really where the power is. And so, I think meditation will help to get us there. And I don't think we, as it was said earlier, I don't think we can change anybody's behavior or anybody's thoughts or beliefs, but we can change our own. And having a more open mind, a more open heart, getting the perspectives out there so that we can ask the better questions. That's how we change.
Well, I want to thank Randy Wong for just presenting us with not only a very clear Taoist perspective of this idea of ceaseless change within the context of a very perfect whole that is always in motion when it is in the manifest world. And also bringing such a quality of compassion and the heart to our conversation that seems to make it worth considering to begin with. It's not just a look at geometric forms, right? But it's something that can affect the lives that we live. And I really want to thank you for that, for deepening our understanding of some pretty abstruse philosophical concepts, and also being able to apply it in our daily lives in a meaningful way. So I really appreciate that, as I'm sure the rest of us do. So thank you once again, Randy. Thank you all who were in
Thank you, Dr.
attendance.
Wong. Wow.